and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the inside info that helped John Howard deal with David Hicks, why Julia Gillard is comparing the Coalition's economic policies to Pauline Hanson, and is it time for Australia to get a new national chant? Our panel tonight, Tim Palmer from the 7:30 Report, author and academic Tony Moore, and James Paterson from The Spectator. Well, John Howard's political memoir, Lazarus Rising, was officially launched today in Sydney, but it was his appearance on the ABC's Q&A program that's had everyone talking. Mr Howard answered questions on everything from his relationship with Peter Costello to the children overboard affair. But while he was defending his decision to send Australian troops to Iraq, one audience member hurled his dirty Dunlop volleys at the former PM.
That's Q&A special with the former Prime Minister, John Howard.
Sorry, Tony, take it as a comment.
Oh, no, we're not going to do that. Please.
And this is for your
just
living.
someone please remove that gentleman. Obviously, we apologise for that.
That's all right, don't worry. Sorry.
And I'm very sorry.
No, forget it.
OK, you're watching...
Relax.
Yeah.
Tony Moore, you were in the front row at Q&A with some of your university students. Give us a blow-by-blow account.
Yeah, well, I should say I was leading a group of international university students, particularly from the People's Republic of China, who wanted to see democracy in action. And I think the ABC delivered by the spade load.
Were they shocked?
They were surprised. I mean, firstly, they were surprised that a former Prime Minister would be on a panel talking to an audience in that manner, that he made himself available like that. So they walked in surprised. But yes, they were absolutely shocked. And one of the Australian ones was Vox Pop by Channel 10 that rocked up afterwards. But for me, I was sitting there in Groundhog Day. I thought, bloody hell, there goes Howard again, giving his fairly accomplished and professional but slightly old-fashioned answers to the questions. You know, I don't think he completely got with the spirit of Q&A in the sense that he was giving the conventional spin that some of my Aussie students would have grown up with. And I was starting to drift off just a slight bit when the shoe questioner, Peter Gray, started to get passionate and asked the question about the International Court of Justice, and Howard didn't answer him.
And then the volleys flew.
Then the volleys flew. And you know, I thought it was a slipper, actually, and I was a bit disappointed to see that Peter Gray looked too much like a hippie. I would have liked it to have been a businessman who did it. But
with a harder shoe, perhaps.
A harder shoe.
Tim, was a pretty ordinary throw, wasn't it, really?
Well, the thrower says that he's received a lot of comments from friends that he throws like a girl today. Although on second look, I thought it wasn't that bad a throw. I think, you know, at least he got the distance.
It wasn't quite
with the
like the Iraqi journalist who threw one at George Bush, though.
Quite, and possibly he might be happy about that because he isn't incarcerated today either, as that journalist was. But, you know, it is, as you say, in the Middle East. When I was a correspondent, the shoe was an almost non-stop motif at every demonstration. The shoes in hands, wiping on flags. The Lala Hotel in Tehran still sports the US flag so that everyone's shoes drag across it at every opportunity. It's just interesting that it's now caught on
in a symbol of the anti-Iraq war
protest. It's spread outside of the region. It's become a global form of protest.
It's gone viral.
Right down to the volleys.
The Australian touch to it there. James Paterson, what did you make of this?
Well, Steve, I think this is a case of saying a lot more about the throwee than the person who was on the receiving end of the shoe. I mean, it really only is when you have such a weak intellectual argument that you can't make your argument with words and you rely on something like throwing a shoe at someone. I think this has said a lot about Peter Gray and said very little about John Howard.
That said, though, I think John Howard likes it. It gave him a lot of publicity for his book today.
He handled it really well. I mean,
yeah, he did.
He did. I once saw Prince Charles shot at with a starter gun, and big points to him. He handled that well. It was a refugee protest. I thought Howard, he calmed the whole thing down. He turned to Tony, who was understandably upset about the show going haywire for a minute. He said, relax.
He's already got form, though, John Howard. He's had a rehearsal at Oxford.
Yeah, indeed.
That's right.
And that was
someone threw a Dr. Martens boot at him at Oxford.
An
Aussie.
Hey, we're all forgetting the woman, though, that was with the thrower. She stood up and followed her fella out and said, John Howard, how does it feel to have blood on your hands or something like that?
And you've got to say that Peter Gray, the shoe thrower, didn't plan this very well, because apparently he went back to ABC front desk about an hour later and asked for his shoes back. He was worried he'd have to get home barefoot.
Well, it'll be like Mrs. Petrov's shoe. It'll become this cult object. It'll be auctioned. It's terrific. But...
And Tony, there's a bit of a history about this with Prime Ministers and ex-Prime Ministers of objects being thrown at them. Billy Hughes, the former Prime Minister...
Well, we have the Federal Police, because Billy Hughes had eggs thrown at him during the conscription debates during World War I, and the Queensland Constabulary and the Queensland government maybe agreed with the protests, and nothing happened. So he said, "I'll show you," and created the Federal Police.
Yeah.
And there's a fine history. I was at a talk that Condoleezza Rice gave at Sydney University, and they didn't throw anything, but they certainly jumped up and said, "How does it feel to have blood on your hands?" And they'd snuck in as students and gave her some curry.
Well, there was another surprise of sorts for John Howard on Q&A last night, a question from David Hicks, although he didn't appear in person.
When you were Prime Minister, you left me in Guantanamo Bay for 5.5 years. During that time, I was detained without charge for a long time. I was denied a fair trial. I was tortured. Do you believe that I was treated humanely and that the military commission was a fair system?
Can I simply say that I defend what my government did in relation to Iraq, in relation to the military commissions. We put a lot of pressure on the Americans to accelerate the charges being brought against David Hicks. And I remind the people watching this program that David Hicks did plead guilty to a series of offences, and they, of course, involved him in full knowledge of what had happened on the 11th of September, attempting to return to Afghanistan and rejoin the people with whom he had trained. So let's understand the reality of what David Hicks pleaded guilty to.
And if you thought John Howard handled that question well, here's some inside information. Apparently he asked Q&A if David Hicks or his father would be in the studio audience. The program's producers said no, but that he had sent in a video question. That's interesting, Tony, isn't it? Because he anticipated that question might come up, and it might come up from David Hicks.
He was accomplished at one level in answering that question, and he had the inside running, and he was clever in asking that of the ABC beforehand. But, you know, it was, again, more of that spin. He didn't answer the key question, which was about why was I treated like this so inhumanely. He didn't address that issue, and I think that goes to the core of what unsettled so many Australians about the treatment of Hicks, forgetting about, you know, perhaps the legitimate things that Howard said about Hicks joining Al-Qaeda or training with them. We don't easily take to Australian citizens being treated in that way. And Howard also said in answering that, military commissions, there's a long history of those, you know, that's fine and dandy. Well, in fact, having written a book on the treatment of political prisoners in Australia in the colonial era, I can say that the British were greatly troubled by their own use of military commissions, and they were troubled by the US's use in this case. And, you know, it's the past use has caused great difficulties for democratic governments. And
James, just to pick up on that point that Tony raised, that he didn't answer the part of the question about whether David Hicks was treated humanely. Is that a problem that he didn't answer that part of the question?
Well, I think an even bigger problem is that we've got David Hicks here, who's very comfortable asking other people questions, but is completely unwilling to answer questions himself. He's been back in Australia for a number of years now. He's had hundreds of requests from media organisations for interviews, and he has not submitted to one. What David Hicks wants to do is write his own memoir, get his own version of history out there, but not have that contested or examined in any way. And I think that says a lot about David Hicks. I think it says he's got something to hide. I think it says he's got not much confidence in his own story and how it would hold up under scrutiny.
And Tim, there is plenty of journos around who do want to ask David Hicks a few questions.
Completely. I mean, I for one would like to know the story of his paramilitary adventure from Bosnia through Afghanistan and into Pakistan, but I don't think that overrides what the essential question was. I mean, we were determined that Rudolf Hess would receive good treatment going into the Nuremberg trials. We should be equally determined that David Hicks was given humane treatment, and set that aside from what the charges were against him. It is simply not enough of an excuse to say, look, he's not answering questions about his potential involvement with militant groups, so therefore we can override, we can ignore the question of how humanely he was treated. That question wasn't answered by John Howard.
James?
Steve, one thing that I think is really unseemly about all this debate about David Hicks is the enthusiasm with which David Hicks is received by some on the left. He's treated as if he's a real cause celebre. I mean, he gets defended for his horrible time in detention, and no one would contest that it would have been awful. But let's remember, this is a person who's admitted to training with terrorists, who has, frankly, sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic and racist views, and has freely admitted this. I don't understand why so many people have flocked to his cause and held him up like some kind of hero.
Tony, you want to come in here?
I think there's a lot to say about that view. I just make the point that again and again, authority turns people into martyrs by overreaching in that way, by using a mallet to smash an acorn. And by the United States, a great democracy, a great defender of liberty around the world, using rendition, taking people through other countries, putting people off US territory. I know technically Guantanamo Bay is US territory, but it isn't really. They didn't want them back there. By doing that, they made martyrs of these people and gave those on the left silly enough to think that a world Arab, pan-Arabic, pan-Muslim empire was a good cause. It gave credit to that. And so the strategy was poor, and it was inhumane, and it was cruel.
OK, let's move on to federal politics issues today, and the plan to merge the ASX with Singapore's stock exchange is already on shaky ground. Not only does the proposal have to clear the usual regulatory hurdles, it also needs a parliamentary approval, and a number of MPs are opposing that deal. Greens leader Bob Brown says Singapore is an authoritarian state with little regard for Australia or its customs.
This is a state that tramples all over freedom of speech, democracy, the rights of oppositions, the ability for public discourse. It is a classic rule by the oligarchs of Singapore. And the proposal here is that effectively the Australian Stock Exchange in Sydney be subjugated to Singapore, and we'll see it wither on the vine.
Independent MP Bob Katter has also condemned the idea.
It is like selling or giving the control of the gearing system in your motor car to some other driver. I mean, this is the mechanism by which the Australian economy operates. It'll be controlled by people overseas.
Tim, it's not a fait accompli. It's got to go through a few hoops.
Yeah, it's far from a fait accompli. In fact, it's not only got to go through the FIRB, the Foreign Investment Review Board, but I think the biggest hurdle now could be the GERB, the Greens Investment Review Board. I mean, if the market yesterday was suggesting this was a 60-40 likelihood, I think by late this afternoon